Trading the captain Brad Marchand. Are we yay or are we nay?
You're Locked On Bruins, your daily podcast on the Boston Bruins. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, Bruins fans, and welcome back to the Locked On Boston Bruins podcast. I'm your host, Ian McLaren, and this is a daily show where we discuss all things Spoked Beat. Today is Tuesday, February 4th, and I want to thank you so much for making Locked On Bruins part of your daily routine. Free and available on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube. Please subscribe and make it part of your day every day. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Before we get started today discussing the merits of trading or entertaining offers for Captain Brad Marchand, as well as previewing tonight's game against the Minnesota Wild, a quick reminder, you can find the podcast on social media at Locked NHL Bruins, and you can find me, my hockey thoughts, dad jokes, at Ian C. McLaren. Now, I have a bit of a history discussing this topic. Some of you may recall a couple of years ago, I floated the idea on what was then called Twitter, that if Patrice Bergeron and or David Krejci were to retire, that it would benefit the Bruins to at least entertain trade offers for Brad Marchand. The then veteran forward, now captain of the team, responded directly to that on social media saying, tough take. But these discussions are coming back into the forefront because the Bruins are falling out of the playoff picture. Brad Marchand is an unrestricted free agent at season's end. And there's real questions about whether or not he could fetch a massive return in a trade to help a Stanley Cup contender get over the hump. And also whether you want to commit more years and more dollars to a guy who still playing very strong, but is entering, the final years of his career, to be sure. Do you want to be paying him Elias Lindholm money this coming offseason as a 37-year-old? Because looking at the two players, Marchand is worth much more than Lindholm here to the Boston Bruins at this point. Now, this is coming up again because, for one, Elliot Friedman on the 32 Thoughts podcast last Friday said if the Bruins continue on a path toward not making the playoffs, the team could indeed look to deal the captain. He said, quote, if Boston takes on water, I'm going to be really curious to see where this goes, because there was a time in this year where I didn't think there was a chance that Marchand was going to be out. And I think now it's not as certain depending on what happens here. Again, he's 36, pending free agent, entering the final season of an 8-year deal with a cap hit of $6.125 million per season. Could be a great rental for a contender, as well as a guy that could be re-signed to give a perennial contender a few more good years. The Bruins, let's be honest, are not in that stratosphere at the moment. In fact, they are outside of the playoff picture. And you look at the short to long-term future of this team, and it's perhaps best served by flipping out some assets and bringing in some draft picks, prospects, even some young roster players. And that's what you would get from a Brad Marchand trade. Ideally, a first-round pick or two. If it's to a Stanley Cup contender, it could be a late first-round pick, so there's debatable value there. But if a team is willing to give up a top NHL-ready prospect who maybe isn't quite ready to contribute but has a bright future, or maybe a couple prospects like that, that's definitely something to look at. Like in Toronto, for example, you look at Fraser Minton and Easton Cowan, or you look at Tampa Bay, Connor Geekie, perhaps. These are the kind of guys that you would be interested in. Former first round high draft picks with bright futures and loads of upside. So that's the yay side of things. That's why you would look to do this. Brad Marchand himself addressed these rumors and reports coming out. He said he's not really worried about what's being said in the media. At the end of the day, the Bruins are going to make the decision for the group that they feel is necessary. He said, quote, I have no control over that. I'm going to worry about what's going on here and play for this group. As long as I'm here, I'm a Boston Bruin, and that's what I'm worried about. Don't forget, the Bruins came into this season expecting to not only make the playoffs, but to have been built for the playoffs after adding Elias Lindholm and Nikita Zadorov in the offseason. Things went sideways in training camp with the Jeremy Swayman contract stalemate, Lindholm injured, Marchand and David Pastrnak coming in off seasons where they were not really up to their normal regimens. Brad Marchand said it has been a different year. They're facing some adversity. All they can worry about is the day-to-day. And they are coming off a big win over the New York Rangers over the weekend. But their chances of making the playoffs remain pretty slim. If you look at Money Puck, for example, playoff odds as of this morning, the Bruins are at 24.7%. If we look at The Athletic and their playoff projections, I believe the Bruins not quite in the picture there either. Just pulling it up here. All that to say, the Bruins, very unlikely to make the playoffs, and that makes you wonder if they believe this is just a blip and that they can come back stronger next year with the cap going up a bit, if they can retool with some other players. The Athletic, for the record, has the Bruins at 29% to make the playoffs. So not looking good at all. And if you can trade Brad Marchand for a massive package of high-end prospects or even young roster players and some picks, it's definitely something you have to look at. This is your opportunity to do the most in the trade market. You can look at guys like Trent Frederick, Justin Brazeau, Morgan Geekie, perhaps even a Charlie Coyle or Brandon Carlo, but nobody is going to fetch you the kind of return that Brad Marchand would because of his pedigree, his playoff performances in the past, his Stanley Cup Game 7, 2011, chipping in 2 goals, everything that he brings to the table, getting under players' skin, big goals, leadership, everything that this guy brings to the table is what you want to get over the hump in the playoffs. Any team would love to have a guy like Brad Marchand in the playoffs, including the Boston Bruins. Make no mistake. And while it does make sense to see what you can get for him, and if you can put together a massive package for Brad Marchand, there's every reason to say, yay, go for it. But at the same time, franchise legend, your current captain, there's several reasons to pause and say, no, we're not doing that. And we'll discuss the nay side of things here as the podcast continues. Super Bowl 59 is here. 1 game, 2 teams, endless possibilities. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's the icing on the cake. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, the official partner of Super Bowl 59. Now, before we discuss the nay side of whether or not to trade Brad Marchand, it is worth noting that he does have some no trade protection. An 8-team no trade list. So that leaves, by my count, 31 minus 8, 23 teams that the Bruins can trade Brad Marchand to without having to have his permission. So they would have to assess the 8 teams on his no trade list. And if there are contenders outside of that list willing to cough up, then they can trade him without having to get his consent or get him to sign off on it, basically. It's a pretty big group, really. And I don't know. I won't speculate on which teams would be on that list, but it's a very real possibility that a bunch of teams with the wherewithal to acquire him are not on his list. And it's quite possible that they will come calling sooner than later. I did see this morning Chris Johnson of The Athletic reporting that trades are allowed during the Four Nations face-off. I was unclear as to whether there was going to be a trade freeze like we see over the holidays. Probably won't see too many trades, perhaps because guys are either participating or on holiday with their family. That would be kind of disruptive. It's still possible that it would happen, but unlikely. And that's why we're seeing a rush of deals here before the Four Nations. Mikko Rantanen, JT Miller, Morgan Frost, Joel Farabee, etc. Marcus Pettersson. Now, when it comes to an argument against trading Brad Marchand, well, there are several to be made, of course. He is one of the best players in franchise history. He's your current captain. And even though he is 36 years old, he still obviously has a lot of gas left in the tank. He currently has 42 points in 54 games. He's not the 100-point player or even the point-per-game player that he was just a few seasons ago, but he still is a very high-level player for the Boston Bruins and a guy who, if we're looking at a quick retool here, can help you over the next 1, 2, 3 seasons if the Bruins are serious about sustained success and bouncing back quickly and not going into a full rebuild mode. And the likelihood is that they will not be doing that. Why? Because they have Jeremy Swayman, Charlie McAvoy, and David Pastrnak all in or near the primes of their careers. And those are 3 guys that many teams, if not all teams around the NHL, would love to build around. You also have, maybe regrettably, committed to Elias Lindholm and Nikita Zadorov for several more years. And so as long as you've made those commitments, you're going to want to try to surround the team and be as successful as possible in order to kind of, I don't want to say save face, but in order to kind of justify those investments. It would look pretty bad for Don Sweeney and Cam Neely to say, hey, ownership, we have asked and you've delivered for us to sign these 2 marquee free agents to big money, long-term contracts. But, we're going to call a mulligan and say this team just really isn't very good and maybe fall out of the playoffs for a couple years. Make no mistake, the Jacobs family wants that playoff revenue. Playoff revenue is bankable. The players, don't forget, are not paid in the playoffs, so the home dates for those playoffs are very valuable. It's been a rough few years economically. Uncertain times right now. You want to bring in as much gate revenue as you can, and the Bruins want to be a playoff team. So trading Brad Marchand less than 2 years after naming him your captain would be a step backwards, to be sure, an even bigger step backwards than what you have already taken to start this season. Again, if you're getting top prospects, like legit top prospects in return, then you can kind of spin that and say, well, we still have these 3 core guys. We've signed these complimentary guys. If you're trading Brad Marchand, you better be entertaining offers for all your veteran players. And perhaps they can spin it in a positive so that it's, yeah, we're trading these guys, but we're going to really quickly turn this thing around. But I say for that leadership continuity, for the work ethic that Brad Marchand brings to the table, for all the intangibles and the on-ice production that he is still bringing each and every night, there's a great argument to be made for the nay side of things. Now, as far as my official position, I'd said years ago, it has to at least be entertained. You can't not take those calls if someone is asking what it would take to acquire a Brad Marchand. If someone team with Stanley Cup aspirations very much in the now comes ringing and says, we will give you X top prospect, Y top prospect, 2025 first round draft pick, 2026 first round draft pick, and this established roster player, any combination of those things, it would be very difficult to say no to that. Plus, you'd be recouping some cap space that you can use this offseason to sign someone perhaps a bit younger. In terms of the leadership void that would be left, you do have David Pastrnak, Charlie McAvoy as potential next captains. It's a very difficult conversation. It's a very difficult decision. Again, as Elliot Friedman said, it is something that we wouldn't have expected even a couple of months ago to be a conversation. The Bruins, again, were built for the playoffs. Right now, they're on the outside looking in, and it's not looking good at all. And if a team comes calling, then you can't not entertain those conversations. Marchand will be taking part in the Four Nations face-off. Perhaps that will boost his value even more if he is able to look pretty solid alongside his buddies Nathan McKinnon, Sidney Crosby. The trade deadline is set for March 7th, so 1 month and 3 days from today. And it's going to be very, very interesting to see what the mandate is for the Bruins, which one of those two paths they take, whether it's trying to add to the roster or trying to retool, and whether or not Brad Marchand is part of that retooling. Let me know what you think. Hit me up in the comments on YouTube. Reach out on social media at Locked NHL Bruins. What's your take on trading Brad Marchand? Are you a yay or are you a nay? And coming up here, as the podcast continues, we are going to focus on the present and preview tonight's game between our Boston Bruins and the Minnesota Wild. Bruins Wild tonight at TD Garden. The Wild will be without forward Ryan Hartman, who was suspended for 10 games for an egregious incident the other night. They're without their leading scorer in Kirill Kaprizov. They still do have some very, very talented players, and they do have a winning record of 31-18-4 coming into this one. They are coming off a loss to Ottawa, but prior to that, they had won 3 straight, including wins over Chicago, Toronto, and Montreal. Over their past 10, however, they are only 4-6, and they themselves are in the thick of a playoff race in the Western Conference. Right now, the Wild sit in the 3rd spot in the Central Division, just 2 points up on the Colorado Avalanche and with a game in hand. So this is one that they are going to be fighting hard for in order to stay ahead of the Avs. Now, there is a bit of a divide between the first and second wildcard spots, 5 points, in fact, between Colorado and Calgary. Minnesota's therefore 7 points up on the second wildcard spot, and 9 points up on Vancouver for this dropping out of the playoffs. So their playoff spot is far more secure than the Bruins, but still, it will be a game that they're going to want to take for sure. They're coming in with some very good goaltending. Philip Gustafsson, 20-11-3 with a .913 save percentage. Jeremy Swayman still sitting on 17-7-4 record and an .895 save percentage. Over the last 5 games, they're led in scoring by youngster Marco Rossi, who's got 1 goal, 5 assists for 6 points. David Pastrnak with 5 goals, 6 assists for 11 points to lead the Bruins in all of those categories over the past 5 games. This will be the first of 2 meetings between these two teams. They'll play next on March 2nd in Minnesota, an afternoon game there. The Wild have a pretty good team defense, allowing only 2.83 goals per game. They're scoring 2.89 goals per game. So that ranks them 18th in offense, 11th in defense. The Bruins, and this shows you kind of where they're at in terms of playoff teams or in the NHL landscape at large. The Bruins team defense is 24th, allowing 3.22 goals per game. They're 25th in scoring at 2.76 goals per game. Their power play is 30th ranked at 15.2. This is the Bruins. Penalty kill is 25th ranked. Thankfully, Minnesota's penalty kill is worse. They rank 31st, and their power play is not much better. They are at 23rd. That just shows you it's kind of a miracle that the Bruins are even in the playoff race at this point, with ranking so poorly in goals for, goals against, power play, penalty kill, and also goal differential, where they are currently 14th in the Eastern Conference at -26. Very shocking to see the Bruins with that poor of a goal differential. Right now, they have a point percentage of .537, which is good for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10th in the Eastern Conference, with the New York Islanders, who finally lost after going on a lengthy winning streak, and the New York Rangers slightly behind at .529 and .519 respectively. Montreal Canadiens even still hanging around, even though they've lost 3 in a row at .510. Pittsburgh, Philly, and the Sabres all below 500, the only teams below 500. Technically, the Bruins are, outside of the playoff picture at the moment, 1 point out of a wild card spot. Right now, your top 4 in the Atlantic is Florida, Toronto, Ottawa, and Detroit. In terms of point percentage, you have Florida, Toronto, Ottawa, Tampa, and then Detroit having overtaken the Bruins because they're on a 6-game winning streak. Ottawa, very surprising right now. They've won 5 in a row, .585 point percentage, a +11 goal differential. You got to think Tampa is a playoff team. So all this to say, it's going to be very difficult for the Bruins to get back in that mix, and very difficult decisions ahead for Cam Neely, Don Sweeney, and that may become clearer here after this week's action. They played Minnesota tonight, the Rangers in New York tomorrow night, and then they host Vegas on Saturday. 3 pretty tough games that could really spell out where the Bruins go from here. On tomorrow's episode, we will recap the storylines, signals, and stats from tonight's game against the Wild. We'll preview tomorrow night's game against the New York Rangers, and we will bring you all the latest on the black and gold, because that's what we're all about here on the Locked On Boston Bruins podcast. Please check out the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast next to get all the tips you need to win your league this week. And also, subscribe if you haven't already. Please take care of yourselves. If you have not, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and subscribe to the podcast. Again, check us out here tomorrow on Locked On Boston Bruins, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day.